Evening, everyone. I'm Dave Webb, co-organiser with Paul Marchant of Cafe Scientifique Headingley. Thanks for joining us on this, the first of our online meetings. Tonight we're looking at a subject of some interest to most of us in Leeds, assessing the impact of airport expansion on the climate, and in particular, we're looking at the case of Leeds Bradford Airport. There are many airports in the UK and beyond that have plans to expand, and many cities are looking at how any future expansion will impact on their commitments to rapidly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And tonight's talk will explore the key issues around impacts on the climate and current and future sustainability of aviation. Our speaker is Jefim Vogel, a PhD researcher on the Living Well Within Limits project at the Sustainability Research Institute at the University of Leeds. His research explores the links between climate mitigation, energy use, sustainability, and human well-being, and reconciling ecological sustainability with human need satisfaction. So without further ado, we'll pass on to Jefim. Thank you very much for coming tonight, Jefim. Over to you for your contribution. Thank you.
Okay, I'll share my screen. I hope that works. Let me see if you can see my screen. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I won't be able to see anyone. So if you can't hear me for any reason or whatever, you'll have to let me know just by speaking to me, because I can only see my PowerPoint screen, okay? So, yeah, I'll be talking today about assessing or misassessing the climate impacts of airport expansion. And I'll talk in particular about the case of Leeds Bradford Airport. Some of you may have seen this little cartoon here by Christopher Harry, which kind of outlines already part of the issue, that we have the climate targets that Leeds City Council has adopted, where we need to really rapidly reduce emissions. And then we have the plans to expand Leeds Bradford Airport, and that might not go so well together. And that's basically what I'll speak about. But I'll first give a brief introduction about the climate emergency and sort of the climate targets that have been adopted in Leeds. Then I'll talk sort of and its climate impacts more generally, sort of in the global and national context, and talk a little bit about like methods for estimating climate impacts of aviation in general and of airport expansion specifically. And then I'll look at the case of Leeds Bradford Airport, or the planned expansion, and will particularly critically assess the climate impact assessment that Leeds Bradford Airport has put forward with the planning application. So briefly, what's this climate emergency all about? I'm sure everyone is familiar with it, but just so we're all on the same page, I'll just run you through this quite quickly, again, assuming that we all are familiar with this. And I'll do this only in terms of impact, just so we get a sense of like why this is such a big deal. The first thing is that what we may see is more of all things terrible. So that means an escalation of the frequency and severity of heat waves and droughts, which we've already seen in the last years, of wildfires. This is quite close to home in Ilkley Moor. Someone has their mic on, by the way, so if they could mute themselves, please. And floodings, again, very, very close to home here in Leeds, as well as storm surges. And this was earlier this year in Australia, the unprecedented wildfires there, and the ones in California also this year. There will also be regions, or there's the risk of regions becoming uninhabitable, either because they're simply too hot to live in. This is the days per year where the temperature thresholds just gets to deadly values where people may not be able to survive. And the other reason is that regions can just be inundated, just be underwater. This is the example of Bangladesh, where with just 1 meter sea level rise, 15 million people would be affected. There's a real risk of food and water shortages. We're already starting to see water crises around the world. Last year in India, India's sixth biggest city was almost out of water, and food production is already affected. There is a big impact on people losing their livelihoods, which forces migration, which along sort of other reasons for environmental migration specifically adds climate migration on top, and several hundred million may be affected by this just by 2050. And there's also big public health impacts through nutrition, through heat, also through and I guess in this year more than ever, we know what a medical emergency looks like, and the chair of the Lancet Commission says climate change is also a medical emergency. This point is often forgotten or not talked about so much, is that all these impacts also supercharge the potential for crises and violent conflict around the world. So they exacerbate the risk of food crises and famines, water crises, but also of conflict and war over food, over water, over land, over resources, and also over national identity or migration. So this report on the left here that you can see states that security risks at high degrees of climate change seem likely to be at a different order of magnitude. That means a factor 10 or higher. And they're even threatening those that are currently considered developed and stable. So that includes very much the UK. All of this is happening within huge injustices, and basically a double injustice. On the one hand, the injustice of emissions, and on the other hand, the injustice of the impact. So this map just gives a flavor for the countries that have caused a lot and don't experience so many impacts. That's the sort of the red and brown countries. And on the other hand, countries that haven't contributed so much to the problem, but that are experiencing most of the impacts. That's the countries in the yellow and green colors. And what's particularly tragic about this is that this happens exactly along other gradients of injustice that are already prevalent in our economic and political systems. So if we connect the dots, then what's at stake here? And maybe one way of summarizing that is how Hans-Joachim Schellnhuber has summarized this, is say, what's the difference between 2 degrees and 4 degrees of global warming? And the difference, he says, is potentially human civilization. So that's what's at stake. Now, what does this imply? Why am I sort of running you through this? The point is not to scare you, but really to get our focus clear and our priorities right. So I think it implies that tackling the climate emergency should really be seen as an issue of overriding priority for every body of governance and power, also for individuals. And it implies a complete discontinuation with business as usual. So in light of what's the risks if we continue business as usual, I think current ways of living and ways of doing business, importantly, cannot be seen as legitimate, and they can't be expected to be sustained. We can't just expect to keep going as we do. It also means there's very little room for kind of yes, but, right? Every but must be really weighed and livelihoods on a massive scale and against the very real risk of, against the very real threat, at least, to human civilization. Okay. Briefly, what this implies. So if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, which is considered, well, not safe, but which would sort of is considered to avert the worst impacts, this raises question of how this is done internationally. And for the UK, what's considered a fair contribution to meeting these targets, to, well, essentially meeting the Paris Agreement or the 1.5 target, would look like this, like the 2 green curves here. The 2 red curves don't cut it, right? And what's important about these green curves, in particular this one, is that by the year 2030, we need to have reduced our emissions by 85 to 95%, depending on how we account for emissions. So 85 to 95% of emissions need to be slashed in the next 10 years. And that is to give you a flavor of the timescales of things, of the urgency, of the kind of pace at which we need to reduce emissions. Okay, how are we doing in Leeds then? In March last year, Leeds has declared Leeds City Council has declared a climate emergency and has adopted what's called the Leeds Carbon Roadmap, which is proposed by the Leeds Climate Commission, which is basically a plan for how Leeds can do its part in limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. And what you can see here, I hope you can see my mouse cursor, by the way, is Leeds emissions over time until this point, which was 2018. And in order for Leeds to do its part to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, we must move away from this kind of business as usual curve here and go on this very steep decline that kind of resembles this decline curve that I showed for the UK. Now, the problem is that curve that you just saw, which I've plotted again here, the dashed curve, and this kind of is a stylized version of the business as usual curve of emissions reduction, is actually not even quite enough, because what this doesn't account for is all the imports, all the things that we import. So if we include for those, if we account for those, it needs to look like this. So even much steeper. So again, be clear about sort of the scope of the challenge here. That's what I'm trying to get across here. Okay, now I want to go briefly into aviation. Again, more generally, I'll look at the UK first. So unlike some other sectors where emissions actually have started to go down, aviation is just going up and up. The fastest growing emissions sector in the UK. And but that raises the question, well, who's sort of taking all these flights? Who's responsible for that? And this is really a highly unequal distribution. So globally, a study that came out recently, it says 1% of the people cause half of global aviation emissions. And for the UK, it looks actually quite similar. So these graphs here on the left show you the number, the upper one shows the number of return flights per year, plotted against income, where on the right we have high incomes, low incomes on the left. So you can see this really increases with income, and it's kind of the people in the high incomes that take much more flights than the people in the low incomes. And looking at this one down here, you can see that this was last year, 2019, that 1% of the people, almost a fifth of all flights abroad. So 1% taking 20% of all flights abroad. That gives you a sense of just how unequal that is. So in the UK, over 70% of flights are taken by just 15% of the population. That was in 2013, 2014. And 18% of all flights abroad are taken by the 1%. By 1% of the population. That's this graph that I just shown you. And also the other part is that more than 50% of the population doesn't fly at all in any given year. Okay, another issue around aviation, and you'll hear this a lot, is this claim that yes, okay, the aviation produces a lot of emissions, but don't worry, sustainable aviation is around the corner. We'll decarbonize flights, and then we can continue flying as we have been. And I want to briefly look at that. First, by looking just at the sort of very simple dynamics of technological improvement versus growth in flight numbers. So this is a very, very simplified, well, type of equation, if you will. I won't bother with you with many equations today. So in very simplified terms, you can look at the change in flight emissions, the percent change that is in flight emissions, as composed of the percent increase in flight passengers minus the percent efficiency improvement. Yeah, and what that means, what that means is that if the percent increase in flight passengers here is larger than the percent efficiency improvement, then flight emissions increase. And that's exactly what's been happening. Efficiency improvements have happened, but have always been outpaced by much, much faster increases in flight passengers. So that you can kind of think of that as running down on an upward running escalator, and that's an escalator that's running faster than you can. Now, in fact, it's actually a bit more complicated and a bit sort of worse than that, because there's what's called the rebound effect. So in fact, the efficiency improvements don't only sort of like compete with increasing passenger numbers, they drive increasing passenger numbers. You can think of that like if for example, fuel gets more efficient, so the aviation companies can run their planes with less fuel, then the tickets might get cheaper, and then people will buy more flights, will fly more. And so, yeah, there's more flight passengers or more flight kilometers. Okay, as a quick spoiler, sort of a quick zoom into the case for Leeds Bradford Airport, the proposed expansion, and this is kind of really just a back of the envelope calculation here, the proposed expansion foresees roughly 80% passenger increase by 2030. Now, with the sort of super simple equation I gave you up there, what that means is if we want to keep emissions even just constant, yeah, even just constant, and I've shown you that what we need is we need to really reduce emissions. Well, for them to be constant, we need to see 80% efficiency improvement by 2030. And the problem is that that's not going to happen, because zero carbon aviation is not as much around the corner as some will have it. So the problem is fuel efficiency improvements are slow and very limited because that's mature technology. There's not much room for improvement there anymore. And completely alternative technologies like biofueled or electric aircraft is rather immature technology. So that's not at all ready yet for deployment at scale. And rollout at scale is always slow. So essentially, if we think back of kind of the timescales of change that I talked about earlier, this will really hardly be relevant for the time period in which the bulk of emission reduction needs to happen, which is basically the next 5 years, certainly the next 10 years. There's also other environmental and justice issues associated with these alternatives around food security, which is related to biofuel production, around biodiversity, which is also related to biofuel production, and the use of critical materials, for example, in electric aircraft related to the production of batteries. As I just told you, the rates of technological improvements are outpaced by faster rates of increased passengers. So in summary, technology can absolutely help to reduce emissions from aviation, but is not sufficient to reduce emissions fast enough if current passenger levels are maintained, and certainly not if passenger levels further increase as they do. Okay, now briefly to the topic of how do we actually account for climate impacts of aviation. And in theory, the picture is really quite complicated. And there's been quite a lot of debate. Don't worry, I'm not going to go into detail with this at all, but just to tell you there's a lot going on. Yeah, so it's not just kind of that planes burn fuel and that causes CO2 emissions, and that, as we know, causes climate change. But there is what's called the non-CO2 effects of aviation. And these have been the subject of much debate. There's recently been a big international study has come out that I would say, yeah, really progresses this debate and brings some sort of like really clear insights. And sort of like breaking it down, this is the punchline. Of all the climate impacts of aviation, only 34% are actually CO2, whereas contrails and sort of the interaction between contrails and clouds account for 57%, and nitrogen oxides and other reactions cause about 9%. So it's really not just CO2 emissions. And in fact, as you can see, CO2 emissions is only about a third. So that means the total climate impacts of aviation are about 3 times larger than the climate impacts of just the CO2 emissions from aviation alone. And this is really important because often only the CO2 component is being reported or considered, which means you would only consider a third of the total climate impact and ignore 2/3. So this can be approximated then by just saying, okay, because we know this ratio, this is sort of empirically, well, empirically and theoretically estimated. We can just say, okay, we then estimate the total climate impact of aviation as 3 times the flight emissions. So the F here is the total impact, and the F with this weird head is just the flight emissions. So important is just 3 times that. Okay, now when it comes to sort of normal airport operation, there is a convention for how you account for that, and that is that for any given airport, you only count the emissions from departing flights, not those from arrival flights into the flight emissions for that airport. And in some sense, that makes sense if all airports globally account for their emissions, and if all countries and all regions have stringent climate targets that act on them. And in a very simplified way, the emissions from an airport in normal operation, I'll call them E here, are composed of the emissions from the ground operation, G, and then the emissions from the departure flights only, D. This is all in a non-expansion case, yeah? Now, however, if we're talking about an airport expansion, that logic doesn't quite work, because all additional flights that are caused by an expansion, so both the departures and the arrivals, must be considered because you can make a clear case between the flights that would have been there without the expansion and the additional flights that are only enabled by the expansion, and that's both the departures and arrivals. So both of them must be considered and counted as the emissions of the expanding airport. So that looks like this then. Don't worry, it doesn't get more complicated than this in terms of equations. So the emissions of an airport expansion, or of an airport in an expansion scenario, I should say, are composed of the ground operation emissions in the expansion scenario, the emissions from the departures of the normal, of the sort of the scenario without the expansion, and then the additional emissions or the additional climate impacts of departure flights that are caused by the expansion. This is this delta D, and the additional the climate impacts of the additional arrival flights. So both of them, right? Not just one. Note, for most airports, the departure flights and arrival flights will be roughly the same. So we can summarize this last term as basically just 2 times the departure flights. I'll get back to this later, why I'm saying this. So what that means then is, if we look at only the effect of an expansion, so the change in the climate impact of an airport due to the expansion is the change in the ground emissions plus 2 times the change in the climate impacts of departure flights. And by the way, the ground emissions are generally very small compared to the flight emissions, and the change in ground emissions is then even smaller. I can hear someone's mic on. Could you please mute yourself? I hear some background noise. Thank you. Okay, so now we'll go back to the case of Leeds. As I said, last year this climate emergency was declared in March. Then just 2 weeks later, the plans to expand Leeds Bradford Airport were announced. So that doesn't go so well together, does it? And some colleagues at University of Leeds and myself, we've sort of done a sort of quick study back then, and looked at how the CO2 emissions or the climate impacts would evolve for different scenarios. Today I'll only focus on the expansion scenario, which is the red one here, and have compared that exactly to this dashed curve, which is the climate targets from this Leeds carbon roadmap that I showed you earlier. This is kind of like the more scientific version of this cartoon sketch that I had at the cover slide. So, and essentially, sort of just like very rough traits, because I'll go more into detail later. What this shows is that with the expansion, the emissions rise quite steeply, whereas the emissions allowance for the whole city of Leeds, the dashed curve here, goes down very quickly. So the emissions that the whole city can emit in each year is rapidly reduced. And in the late 2020s, all the flights to and from the airport alone exceed that. So in this study, we actually looked at the total climate impact, so all flights, because that's kind of what matters for climate. And later I'll look at the impact that can be allocated to the airport. Okay, if you want to take a look at this study, it's published at The Conversation with my co-authors, Joel and Yannick, so you can have a look. Now, moving on to the specific climate impact assessment that Leeds Bradford Airport has put forward in their planning application. We have reviewed them and found them to be quite problematic, in fact, and I'll run you through this in a second. So we have put in our objection to the expansion plans based on what we found to be really systematic bias and big omissions of very important factors in the climate impacts. Okay, so essentially, we break this down into 5 major flaws. There's more of them, but there's sort of like five really big ones that I'll run you through today. So the first one is the omission of non-CO2 warming effects of flights. So as I was telling you earlier, only 34% of the emissions are from CO2, whereas you would really need to multiply that by 3 to get the total climate impact. Leeds Bradford Airport has not done that in their climate impact assessment, which means they're underestimating the emissions, or the climate impact per flight, by a factor of 3. Any flight, factor of 3, right? 300% underestimate. First, big flaw. Second flaw, the omission of additional arrival flights. That's what I just said. So this, the convention, they have basically applied the convention from the normal airport operation, whereas I told you that for accounting for an airport expansion, we need to add both the departure and the arrival flights. So that's basically 2 times the departure flights, because the arrivals are just the same as the departures. So, and even though Leeds City Council explicitly requested Leeds Bradford Airport to include them, Leeds Bradford Airport hasn't done that in their impact assessment. They've just used the departures only. So the difference is the factor 2 here. So that basically means they're omitting half of all additional flights or flight passengers, which means that by that virtue, they're underestimating the climate impacts of additional flights by a factor of 2. And this factor of 2 compounds with the factor of 3 that I was just talking about from the other emission of the non-CO2 effects that comes on top. Now, if we look at these 2 together, what does that look like in terms of numbers? So I'll show you a couple of, quite a few actually, graphs that look like this. So I'll just quickly run you through the general idea. So I'll always show the estimate that Leeds Bradford Airport have put forward in their climate assessment in red, as a red bar. And then I'll show our full estimate, which includes these factors in green next to it. The height of the bars just shows the emissions, their CO2 equivalent emissions, which means they account for the full climate impact. Or well, if they do, yeah, but that's sort of like an equivalent way of showing that. So already in the case without expansion, Leeds Bradford Airport underestimates the emissions by roughly that factor 3, 286% to be precise, which is precisely because of the non-CO2 effects. It's not precisely 3 because this only applies to flight emissions, not to ground emissions. So they're like a very small part in the total emissions. Now, if we look at the scenario where expansion goes ahead, that's the graph on the right here. Emissions look like this. So LBA's estimate is really just a relatively small increase relative to the scenario without expansion, whereas our full estimate shows a really big increase. And what's perhaps even more important is the difference between what we've considered a realistic estimate, considering all the factors that you need to consider, and LBA's estimate, which is in this time almost a factor of 4 too small. Now, the difference gets even bigger if we look just at the change, where LBA's estimate is so that the change due to the expansion, the difference basically between the expansion scenario and a non-expansion scenario, where our estimate is basically 6 times higher than LBA's, because of the combination of the factor 3 for the non-CO2 effect and the factor 2 for the emission of the arrival flights, and the 4% that are off here is again because of the ground operation. Now there's a, if that's not enough, yeah, there's a third flaw, and that is the emission of international flights in key comparisons, with the climate targets for Leeds and also for the UK as a whole. So this is a table from the climate impact assessment that LBA has put forward, and where they compare, as you see here, to Leeds City Carbon Roadmap. You don't need to look at the numbers really. But as you see, they've highlighted here that they're excluding international aviation from these figures. Now, the problem is international flights make up more than 90% of the flight emissions. So if you exclude that, you're excluding 90% of your climate impact. So essentially what that does is it underestimates the emission by roughly a factor of 10. And again, this compounds with the other emissions, those of the non-CO2 effects and the additional arrival flights that I talked about earlier. So if you take all these things together, the difference between a realistic estimate and the estimate that LBA presents is just really gigantic. So this on the left here is the figures that LBA present in their comparison with the Leeds Carbon Roadmap to say something about whether or not the expansion causes trouble for sticking to the climate targets. The climate target for the year 2030 is this horizontal blue dashed line here. So in the year 2030, that needs to be around 1,000 kilotons of CO2. And based on LBA's number, you could think, well, that's not such a big problem because it's quite small. So probably all the other activities of the city, like food, traffic in the city, people heating their homes, that will fit in there. Problem is, if you account for all the things that you should account for international flights, for non-CO2 effects, and for arrival flights, that's not the case. You're much above. So this is the point where in this other graph, the lines had crossed before. So only the emission or the climate impact of the airport in this expansion scenario exceeds the emissions allowance for the whole city. So there's not only is there nothing left for anyone to emit due to consuming food, due to heating their homes or whatever, by itself the airport blows this target. And the difference, the underestimate that LBA states here in their report is a factor 30. So 100% understatement, basically. So it's really quite a bit. if you compare these two columns, they don't resemble the same thing, but they describe the same thing. Just that LBA has omitted everything that's important, and that's how they present their expansion. Well, they don't even present it as sound. They say it's still significant, but they make it look much less bad than it actually is. Okay, I've mentioned this. So so in 2030, with the expansion going ahead, LBA emissions would be 2 times as high as what all of Leeds can emit. So just the airport would completely blow Leeds to climate targets. No way of still meeting them with that going ahead. Now, that's not it. There is a 4th flaw, and that is related to the assessment of cumulative emissions. So cumulative emissions means summing up emissions over time for all the years over a certain period. The problem is that LBA, well, they have done that, but only over a very short period. So Leeds City Council explicitly requested that LBA do this over the whole life cycle of the development, and they suggested 60 years. But LBA only chose 3 single years, 2024, 2030, and 2050, which altogether only comprise a 27-year period. And for cumulative emissions, so like for summing up emissions over a period, they should have done this over 60 years. They should have certainly done this over the 27 years where they had data, where they had sort of data points, but they only did it over 7 years. Now, why is that a problem? Well, because cumulative emissions is sort of like, gives you sort of like the grand total effect, the grand total climate impact of this development. And because CO2 emissions act essentially cumulatively, so it's kind of the total emissions over time that matter for climate change. This is really an important metric to look at. So what we've done is we've taken the period that LBA reports. So this is their cumulative emissions number that they state in the report for the period 2024 to 2030. And we've calculated that with the factors included, so the non-CO2 effects and the additional arrival flights. So that's kind of just comparing these 2 periods. Again, big difference. And then we've also calculated what LBA should have calculated is the cumulative emissions over longer periods. This is the period that they provide data for, these 3 data points. And this is the 60-year period that Leeds City Council requested LBA would assess. So a huge difference. The difference between LBA's estimate and the estimate for the period that they have data for is a factor of 17. and the difference to the full period that they should have assessed is a factor of 32. So what this means is that the largest sort of cumulative number, the largest total climate impact that they state is a factor, well, 30 lower than what this will cause over the whole period. Now, this is, in a way, you could say comparing apples and oranges. Yes, because we're comparing different periods here. Of course, the emissions over a longer period will be larger. The problem is that LBA should have provided oranges, but only provided apples, right? So we need those numbers to evaluate the climate impact of this development. All LBA provided was this, so really incomplete picture. Now, if you look at what's called the carbon budget for Leeds, so that's the maximum allowance that Leeds, the whole of Leeds, so the whole city, is allowed to emit over the period between 2018 and 2050, that is 42 megatons. That was also adopted in the climate emergency declaration. And the cumulative emissions that LBA present, the over these 7 years, well, is substantial, but is, you know, quite a bit below that. However, if they had estimated it over the same period that the carbon budget is for, and if they had included non-CO2 effects and if they included additional arrivals, well, then the emissions just from the airport below the budget. So in other words, the emissions, the climate impact from the airport itself, if it expands from now until 2050, exceeds the carbon budget for the whole of Leeds. So there will be not a gram, not a milligram of carbon left for anyone else or anything else to emit, because the airport would have already taken up all of that. Or the other way around, if anything else still emits anything, then there's no way for Leeds to meet its climate targets, and we contribute to more severe climate changes and climate impacts that I talked about at the start. So again, LBA emissions alone will exceed the whole city's carbon budget, and that way it would be impossible for Leeds to meet its climate targets. Now, the last figure, I think, no, the second last, is only looking at the difference. This is kind of the most extreme underestimate, if you will. So this is basically still cumulative emissions over different periods. And in this case, LBA's numbers are really puzzling because they basically state that with the expansion, their cumulative, the difference between the expansion scenario and the non-expansion scenario, if you aggregate the emissions of that over these 7 years, well, there's almost nothing, because they state emissions don't grow on balance over this period. Well, if you account for non-CO2 effects and if you account for additional arrival flights, they do very much so. And if you look at this over a much longer period, the effect of just the expansion is very massive. And again, so comparing to, it gets close to the carbon budget for the whole city. So just in this case, the numbers are really just mind-buzzing. So the difference to the period 2024 to 2050 is more than a factor 200. The difference to the 60-year period that they were supposed to analyze is more than a factor 400. Again, same issue, apples versus oranges, but again, LBA was supposed to provide oranges. It didn't, so we did. Final thing is, well, since the climate emergency declaration, we don't only have the carbon roadmap, which sort of operationalizes the climate targets for Leeds into this climate budget and this decline curve that I've shown you. But the climate emergency declaration also, Leeds City Council also committed to actually net zero emissions by 2030 already. And this target is not mentioned in the report at all. However, it's very easy for you to think about what that would do. So this is just the example that we had earlier. So this is the expansion scenario in 2030, the emissions that you would have in the year 2030 if the expansion goes ahead. And again, this was the maximum allowance for Leeds as a whole based on the carbon roadmap. But if we now look at the net zero target, well, net zero is down here where zero is. So you can see that's that doesn't look good, right? Even with LBA's own estimate, actually. Okay, so the verdict here, I think, is really quite clear. I would say, in terms of LBA's climate impact assessment, well, if this was a research paper, if this was an academia, I think this paper would get rejected, and I think sort of our analysis, leads us to reject LBA's climate impact assessment. I think it dramatically understates the climate impacts systematically in basically every single metric, and in a way that is really, I think, really misleading. Now, the second question, which is kind of obviously in the room, is okay. Well, what happens with the planning application then? Well, that's for Leeds City Council to decide. But I would say based on our assessment, well, you know what to do. Okay, so finally, basically, sort of instead of a conclusion, if you will, I just want to kind of go back to this idea of the emergency and to say, like, well, what's the sort of mindset, what's the notion for an emergency? And one way of doing that is to think of emergencies that we are familiar with and where we have sort of intuitive responses, and when a house is on fire. And if the house is on fire, we know we need to act right now, no question. Very clear focus. We need to save people. We need to kill the flames. That's the absolute priorities. Nothing else matters in a way. Doesn't matter if we leave some valuables behind. It doesn't matter if the house gets wet, if firefighters are trying to kill the flames. We need to save people. We need to stop the flames from burning. And all hands on deck. Everyone does whatever they can to help, right? So there's no time to wait for help from London. This is obviously a metaphor for the airport case. And there's no time to discuss, which happens a lot, why Manchester isn't doing their thing. Everyone needs to do whatever they can to help right now. So with that, thanks very much for your attention. And yeah, I'm very much looking forward to your questions and comments and to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jefim. Thank you very much. If you could stop sharing now, I can just get a view of everybody. And I just wanted to ask whether people wanted to have a short break before resuming, 5 or 10 minutes maybe, or if you're okay. If you would like a break, could you wave wildly in the air so I can see a couple of people, not too many. A lot of people aren't showing their faces anymore. So can I suggest we just move on a little bit? I think there are a few questions already in the chat list. And if anybody wants to add any more, please do so. I don't know. I think we will try to finish at a reasonable time. So you may not get your question answered if there are so many, too many. Shall we just start from the top and go through a few? And then if people are desperate to leave or desperate for a break, just keep waving. So the first one I think is from Colin Megson, who would like to ask, or he says he's old enough to remember rationing. Rich people pollute the lives of poor people like me, like him, externalizing their pollution. City pollution is costing the UK £19.8 billion per year, and it's coming out of all our pockets. I would like my equally shared ration of flights so I can sell my coupons to the rich polluters. Would this be fair? You want to tackle that one, Jefim?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. That's a great question. Would that be fair? I think it would be fairer than what's currently happening, maybe. I think, however, what needs to happen with tackling sort of flying is a few things probably at the same time. We need to change our transport systems so that we have sustainable alternatives for anything that doesn't desperately need a flight. So if you're not going to cross the Atlantic, if you're just going to move within the UK, for example, or to countries close in Europe, if we have decent and cheap rail systems in place, for example, that could definitely reduce the need for flying. When it comes to rationing, I think there's a few approaches there. there's this idea of a frequent flyer tax, which is basically a tax that kicks in with the numbers of flights that an individual takes. So the first flight would be tax-free, actually, I think, in many proposals. And then the tax goes up very steeply. So the second flight has a tax added, the third flight has quite a lot more tax added, and so forth. And that kind of tries to really tackle the issue of frequent flying, this very unequal distribution of flying that I showed you. Now, that is maybe sort of an idea that could be used immediately, because it could probably get the support from lots of people. However, I think there's limits to using price mechanisms, because essentially very rich people could still, buy their way out of it and just fly as much as they can. And I think we really have to ask the question of like, what's the purpose of flying? Which kind of flights are maybe a bit more necessary or legitimate than others? So like if people are flying to their holiday homes for the third time this year, for the fourth time this year, somewhere to the Mediterranean to spend a nice weekend, well, maybe that's not quite as necessary as someone who sees their family that has fallen ill or something like that. So I think we would need basically a democratic deliberation happening on what kind of flights we want to prioritize as a society going forward, because indeed the direction is that we need fewer flights. I hope I answered that question.
I think so. Thank you. Liz Merrick was saying that Sue Hinchcliffe, the leader of Bradford Council and a candidate for West Yorkshire Mayor, supports the expansion. She stated that 76% of the Bradford emissions are from ground transport and 8% are from aviation. Therefore, the major problem is not aviation. Increasing the number of flights would create 4,000 jobs and bring business into the area, which would otherwise be left behind. How would you reply? Also, do contrails cause the same amount of global warming as CO2?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. Just briefly to the last one, I mean, like, the statistic I gave there speaks to that. So contrails, the effect of contrails is, of all non-CO2 effect is roughly double that of CO2 itself. So the effect of CO2 is only 1/3 of the total. The other 2/3 are from non-CO2 emissions. So that will probably be missing in that statistic that the councillor is quoting. However, well, aviation is not the only thing that causes emission. Absolutely, and road transport is the overall emissions from road transport are bigger than aviation. That's absolutely true. But again, this is kind of like all hands on deck, right? We need to get to net zero emissions. We need to get very close to net zero emissions in the next 10 years. And that means we need to reduce absolutely everything and everywhere. We will really struggle to decarbonize the systems that we really need to meet everyone's basic needs. We need to decarbonize food, we need to decarbonize heating our homes, we need to decarbonize ways of transport, I would say. Yeah, so like ways of commuting to work or commuting to family or something, which can be done by different means. For example, public transport. Yeah, we need to basically decarbonize everything that we need to decarbonize our healthcare and everything that we need to keep going. And flights also need to be decarbonized, and in many cases are probably a bit less essential to people's basic needs. The other issue with flights is that it is probably one of the hardest to decarbonize sectors. So like electricity, heating can be more easily decarbonized. Many industrial processes can more easily be decarbonized. For flights, as I indicated, within the next few decades, there's really very little scope for significant improvement. The sort of the improvement rates, the CCC estimates like rates of 1.4% if we're very optimistic efficiency improvement in flying, and that contrasts with the need for emission reduction rates of between 10 and 20% per year. So that we need to see sort of like across the whole economy, across all sectors. So that gives you a flavor for that. So I think because aviation is such a fast growing sector, what we really can't have, while all emissions need to go down, what we can't have is growing emissions anywhere. So, and airport expansion, what it does is it grows flight levels. And what I was trying to show with a lot of graphs and with theoretical arguments is that if you increase flight levels, if you increase flight passengers, flight numbers, you increase emissions, basically. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, thank you. I think Ian has made the point that as all other, or if all other sectors do reduce their output, then so the impact of aviation grows, in fact, relative to the others, I guess. So he also says it's not true that 4,000 jobs will be created. The latest study from NEF says that it will actually cost the region economically. The climate emergency will also destroy the prospect of jobs everywhere in society, which I guess is true too. I don't know if you want to comment on that, or there's another question: where did the 4,000 jobs value come from? That's from Luke, and the report from LBA says 2,310, as already mentioned. So yeah, unless anybody knows where the 4,000 comes from, we'll move on to the next one. They're also, from Ian, also on a drive to automate, and the airport development leads to automation. NEF estimate that jobs claimed are 33% inflated. Economic case presented by LBA also completely fails to include the cost of outbound tourism or the cost of emissions. I remember seeing a question or a point about how you included the incoming flights. I can't find it now, but I think the question was, why include those? Because they'll be included in somebody else's estimate as outgoing flights. Is that not right?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, just briefly on the last points, I would agree with those concerns about the job arguments brought forward. Jobs, people need jobs, of course, but I think we can't base our jobs on unsustainable and harmful activities. That's the point, right? You can't say, well, whatever gives jobs is legitimate. I think jobs need to be paired with everything else in the economy to provide people a decent life, a safe life, and jobs that are in a sector that are that really threatens human civilization and massive lives. I think is a societal challenge that society as a whole needs to challenge, including the issue of just transition. That is absolutely key, right? So it's not the issue. It's down to the individual person working at the airport. People are it's very hard fates of people working in those industries, but we together need to tackle those issues and need to find solutions for catching people in these industries that we cannot sustain and that we cannot, in particular, cannot expand. Okay, sorry. I was supposed to talk about, the flights, the arrival flights. Well, so the thing is, who is responsible, right? So in this case, it's down to Leeds City Council to decide, does this expansion go forward or not? So that sense, Leeds City Council has the power to decide about these emissions, whether or not they occur. So any additional emissions, all flights, are facilitated by the expansion. If the expansion doesn't happen, these flights cannot happen, basically. I mean, you can sort of, you can make some arguments that maybe they would go to other airports, but we don't really know this. This is essentially as with road transport, if you expand highways, you get more traffic. If you expand airports, you get more flights. So if you don't expand Leeds Bradford Airport, well, it can't take more flights because it doesn't have more capacity. So indeed, the entire difference in flights going to and from Leeds Bradford Airport, in the case of an expansion, would be facilitated by the expansion. So I think in that sense, for Leeds City Council to consider this expansion, that's the number we need to look at. The difference, so it's basically a what if scenario. What happens if we allow this expansion? Well, then this is the difference in emissions that we allow, and that we as Leeds City Council, we have the power to decide over, and in that sense are responsible for the decision.
Yeah, okay, thank you, good point. Hugh Hubbard asked a similar thing, I think. How much of a long-haul international flight emission is counted as belonging to the LBA area? But I guess that's using the same argument there.
Yeah, it's not, yes, it's not about the area, it's about the decision-making power, the constituency. That's the point.
Yeah, okay, well, pass over a few congratulations on your presentation. Liz Merrick wants your contact email again. I don't know if we've given it yet, but is that something you want to give out, or?
Yeah, I mean, I've had it in the presentation. I can also put it privately in the chat, no problem.
Okay, great. And there's a question from Loop Sujathorvin. LBA says they will offset emissions. How feasible is that?
Yeah, great point. Thanks, Lou. It's again, I initially included a whole slide on sort of narratives that are out there that are, maybe I'll show that slide actually, because we're actually going into all of these aspects. So maybe if you don't mind, I'll just briefly share my screen and show that slide. Let me see. Because you're all now talking about, which is good, about the sort of like social issue. Okay, so this speaks to point 3 here. And I'd say there is no such thing as offsetting, really. It's the wrong kind of mindset for it. We can't replace some emission reduction measures with others, because we need both. We need everything. We can't sort of plant our way out of this. But if we can reduce emissions somewhere, we need to reduce them. If we can reduce emissions somewhere else, we also need to reduce them. The same goes for, that's point number 4 here, for the argument with Manchester, right? It's not about Leeds or Manchester. Leeds and Manchester must not expand. Yeah, Leeds and Manchester need to stop their expansions. Okay.
Yeah. And then Benjamin Schammel says, are airport emissions actually accounted for in Leeds' remaining carbon budget? Coming from Austria, I know that Austrian agencies deliberately leave out consumption-based emissions, such as aviation emissions, in their scenarios.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So like the consumption-based emissions, by the way, is this steeper curve that I showed at the start. That includes imports, which are not included in the sort of more simple territorial accounts. So for Leeds, the Leeds carbon roadmap that I showed you, that the Climate Commission has put forward, is based on such a territorial account. However, they are working on a revised version of that incorporates the airport emissions. I think what they're not yet planning to incorporate, but I hope they will in the next iteration, is the emissions from imports. And by the way, they're huge. They're huge. Yeah. So like the emissions, if you include imports, the emissions of Leeds City, sort of that are accounted for Leeds, are almost 3 times as big as if you don't.
Right. And Councillor Andrew Cooper asks, emissions from flying slip between the cracks in international emissions. How could you address, or how could we address that? International emissions reduction agreements.
Great. Yeah, that's a really important question. Thanks, Andrew. So, yeah, I think it's important to say that aviation is both a local issue and a national issue and a global issue. Now, what we must not do is to say is to use that to say like, well, we in Leeds can't do anything about it. The national government must do anything about it. No, because as I said, like in this case, Leeds has this decision-making power. However, absolutely, yeah, we need action at the national and international level. In fact, there are pushes to include aviation in the UK's carbon budget going forward. So in fact, the CCC has recommended this last year, but the Department for Transport didn't follow suit. But as you may have heard of, there is a proposal for a climate and ecological emergency bill, which is being put forward in Parliament, which I was actually a little bit involved in. So I happen to know that this would absolutely include aviation emissions and other emissions that slip through the cracks, so like traded emissions, consumption emissions, and so forth. So that I think is a very promising model that could actually be replicated by other countries. So my hope would be that the UK could go forward with that, and then in COP26 next year, other countries would follow that model. That's very hopeful.
Yeah, we do need hope, but anyway. Then there's a question about hydrogen-fueled aircraft from Colin Megson, but as Andrew Cooper points out, 95% of hydrogen is currently sourced from fossil fuels anyway, so probably doesn't solve any problems. Couple skipping down here. Couple of quick question here to Andrew Cooper. Where can we find your policies? I'm sure that's on the, can you answer that, Andrew? Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I can put a link in the chat, but there's more stuff being developed because it's a few weeks.
Yeah. Yeah, people should ask mayoral candidates where they stand on the LBA. Sorry, okay, question from, who's that from? Hugh Goulburn. Apologies if I missed this, but is there any data available on projected decline in aviation demand emissions due to the pandemic lockdowns?
Great, yeah, thanks. That's the question of the day in a way. I didn't touch upon COVID because it's very difficult to know what's going to happen. The aviation industry hopes and projects that after a very significant decrease now, that aviation demand will go back up. But there's also much less optimistic forecasts. There's basically all sorts of forecasts. I think certainly for the next few years we can expect lower numbers. What happens then very much depends on like how society comes back from the pandemic, if and when that happens. But I think there's really few ruptures sort of that have happened here, and I think sort of some fundamental things are being put into question. So like I think the way that people now work more from home, do these kind of webinars, seminars from home, have international conferences online, do business meetings online. I think that will have an impact on the way we travel for many reasons. I think maybe because of remaining pandemic risks, maybe because people have realized, oh, it's maybe nicer to do this from my living room, to spend more time with my family, and to not spend 6 hours on a flight to New York to have a 2-hour business meeting and then jet back or something. So, I think there is the chance for both cultural change and the changes in sort of like the systems that we use to go about both work and leisure and sort of like communication. And probably the other big hope is that we combine the need to kind of restart our economies in one way or another after this pandemic with the need to tackle the climate emergency and come back green. Yeah, basically start with something like a Green New Deal, and a really sort of completely different logic of the economy that both serves people's needs and takes the environmental issues very, very serious, and takes issues of justice very, very serious.
Yeah, thank you. There is a question about the Manchester effect, but I think you've dealt with that really. If people don't fly from Leeds, they'll go to Manchester. But you've said something on that. There's a point made about, it's quite opportune, I guess, in a way that the mayoral candidates are being voted for at the moment. So this is a good issue that we could press those candidates on. And Andrew Cooper again has said that Bristol Airport expansion has been rejected, so it's possible to oppose airport expansion and still succeed. Question on COVID from Ian. Galba challenged the absence of any impact assessment in the application of LBA, responded by saying they would recover quicker than anyone else, 2 years quicker than industry projections of 4 years. Any comment on that?
I'd be excited to hear what makes them so exceptional. I mean, I'm not sure what their argument is, but I would agree with Ian that that's problematic, that they're not taking COVID into account and providing an updated assessment. And if they do, then they will definitely need to update their climate assessments. Just as I think it was Andrew who mentioned Bristol rejection. So like, obviously this process is ongoing in for the Leeds Bradford Airport. So if people here are getting interested in the issue and feel like they want to do something about them, then do get in touch with GALBA. This is the Group for Action on Leeds Bradford Airport, which I know a few people are in the audience are part of, who offer a lot of resources and ideas for how people can engage with that issue.
Yeah, thank you. Andrew has also pointed out that the Zoom revolution has made the need for travel for business and government purposes much less likely. So maybe that's a good thing. Yeah, Josh has said we could take inspiration from the direct action of groups like Plain Stupid, who took against airports at Manchester, at Heathrow, Stansted and Manchester. Question from Valerie Dew: have your lovely clear drafts been sent to the decision makers at the council and also councillors in Leeds and Bradford? I'm sure they have, but maybe you can answer that in a minute to see what else there is. There's quite a few more messages than I can actually can deal with. Oh yes, you actually answered, or Ian has, yes, but they don't seem to be listening. As Andrew Cooper again, as West Yorkshire is working together on emissions reduction, it's also an issue for Wakefield, Calderdale and his council, Kirklees. There's also a website for the GALBA campaign, the Leeds Bradford Airport, www.galba.uk. Andrew's put a link in about the climate emergency bill. I'll skip over some of these quickly. Will Leeds City Council, this is from Christina, will Leeds City Council say Leeds Bradford Airport emissions will be excluded from Leeds limits and included in national aviation emission limits? So Leeds will forego employment opportunities only for Manchester Airport to expand. Is there national limits? Any comment on that?
So I didn't hear the last part of the question, I don't think.
Sorry, I've skipped past it now. So Leeds will forego employment opportunities only for Manchester Airport to expand? I suppose that's the argument they're saying. If we, forego these opportunities for employment, it will allow Manchester Airport to expand. Are there national limits on the expansion?
So as for the national part, as I said, this is kind of a process that's, that's under development in a way that where the CCC is making more and more stringent recommendations for including aviation targets, and has from the 2008 Climate Act to the updated net zero targets, they have also reduced their recommendations for aviation growth. So now they've recommended quite significantly curtailed aviation growth, which, by the way, so 25% nationally, which, by the way, the Leeds Bradford Airport expansion would go much beyond, 80% or something like that. But of course, also that doesn't get emissions down, does it? So the Leeds versus Manchester argument, I mean, I think I've kind of spoke to that, but so I guess I would go about it this way. If Leeds, or if anyone is serious about creating jobs, create jobs. There's a lot of ways to create sustainable, good jobs, and we have to do that. We should do that, absolutely. And again, like a Green New Deal is labor intensive. There's a lot of things, and it's not just it's both in industries, in renewable energy and public infrastructure, public transport, but also in care work and public, and in healthcare, which I guess we can see right now is understaffed, in social care and education. All these sectors are very labor intensive, and could really generate lots and lots of good, sustainable, meaningful jobs. So it's not like we need harmful developments as the only route to create jobs, if that's what we want, yeah. And again, so if we're serious about the climate threat, and really it's an existential threat. I hope I made that clear at the start. It's an existential threat in the sense that it really puts a very real risk to human civilization in the sense of life as we know it. So if we plow ahead with business as usual, that is fundamentally at risk. This is kind of now mainstream climate knowledge, basically. This is not sort of a alarmist position, yeah. So then this really requires every government, every organization to do something towards that sort of emission requirement, reduction requirement. And that means, again, not Leeds or Manchester. Leeds and Manchester must not expand. Just briefly, I saw the question of hydrogen, which I haven't really spoken to. So just that will kind of go in the technology, in the comments I made about technology. So I think hydrogen. I'm not saying these things should be explored, because I don't think the future should be zero aviation, but very close to, right? So we need, I think we need to very massively reduce the demand for flying, the extent to which people fly. I think there are a few things where flights are justified, let's say. I think if we reduce the numbers massively, then these kind of alternative technologies can be meaningful, because it's a problem of scale. It's a problem of scale and the rate of change, right? So we could, if we had, if we had a tenth or less than that, let's say, of our current fleet, like of our current aircraft fleet, well, that's numbers that we could probably decarbonize. That's, then we could probably talk about electric planes for short haul and maybe hydrogen or biofuel for long haul, but not at the current scales, and definitely not at expanded scales.
Thank you. Yeah. A couple of questions on how travelling by ferry compares with travelling by aircraft, and also could you mention flight free and the idea of a pledge to stop flying? And I think there's just one more, oh no, a couple more have been added since I looked. Okay, yeah, could you just chuckle those ones?
Sure, thanks. Yeah. So flight free, I mean, absolutely, absolutely supported. I myself, I don't fly. I haven't flown in quite a few years, and I'm not planning to. And that's possible. Yeah. I'm not saying it's possible for everyone. It depends on your circumstances. So, like again, if you have family across, the Atlantic or something, I'm not sort of trying to give absolute answers here, but I'm saying, like, by and large, a lot of people could fly a lot less, and I think the flight-free campaign is great because of the signaling more than the individual effect. Yeah, because I'm not sort of like, I think the scale of changes that we need go well beyond individual change, and in particular, we need to be really careful with resisting this push for individualizing the solution. That's a kind of neoliberal agenda to say it's the consumers that need to make better choices to solve the issue. Now, this is a massively political issue here that we need to solve together, as I said, because as a society, we currently have a certain demand for flying. Some things we can get rid of, some things we can't, or not so fast, and that's a really real challenge. And there's, this expansion is a political decision. The challenge for how to tackle aviation in the future, I think, should be deliberated on democratically. So it's both, right? It's individual change mainly or not least for the sake of signaling, but it's absolutely also political change, and that's why I think that this organizing, this campaigning, this lobbying that people at GALBA do, for example, that individuals do and speak to their councils is so important. So I encourage everyone to, if you care about this issue, then please do speak to your councils and make your voice heard there. The ferry part is also a great question. Thank you. Yeah, not all alternatives are clean. Yeah, most ferries anyway, are known to be quite polluting as well. But yeah, so for example, I'll give you a personal example. I traveled to a conference last year by lots of trains and ferries. Yeah, it took me, and one long ferry, so that was not super clean. It was probably a fair bit less polluting actually than a flight, but ferries are not clean. But it took me 55 hours to get there. How many times a year am I going to do that? Once at most, yeah? Whereas if I'd taken a flight, it would have taken me 3 hours, and I can do that, I can do that for a weekend, I can do that whatever. So there's sort of like, there's aspects of the pace of travel and the total travel demand. If you travel slow, you're not going to travel as much. And traveling by ferry, you're not going to travel to Australia by ferry. I mean, you can, but that's quite an undertaking. So, the flying is fast and gives you access to the whole world within a day, basically. Yeah. And people make use of that. Whereas if you commit to slow traveling, well, then you sort of, your radius that you circulate within is much reduced, and that itself makes a big difference, because that really reduces your travel demand.
Yeah, thank you. I think we've covered most of the things, most of the points. There was a point made by Ian about the night flights and how also there's an impact on health from noise, which is also important, although not really part of your presentation, I guess, really. There's a question from Colin Megson on how do you imagine a party would be elected that wanted to curtail the UK's inordinate overseas holiday craze. I can't see there's a future in one that doesn't do that, but I don't know if you have any particular comment you want to make there. And one question about, this is being recorded, and we will put the link to the recording, we'll put it on YouTube. There'll be a link to it from our website as soon as I can get it done. So that will be up there soon, I think. I don't know if you want to add any more, but I just want to thank you very much, Jefim, for coming along tonight and for giving such a brilliant presentation. Good luck to you and to Galba in their efforts to stop this expansion of the airport and maybe even to wind the thing down eventually. So final comments over to you, Jefim.
Yeah, many thanks. I mean, again, thanks so much to you and Paul for the invitation and for everyone for really great questions and engaging discussions in the chat that I was only able to kind of skim through because there seems to be a lot of discussion going on there. Yeah, that's really great. I'm glad that people are care about this topic, and I want to also say, like, by focusing on climate, I don't want to sideline the other issues. There's a lot of aspects to this airport expansion that people can take issue with, like noise is a real issue if it, you know, if these planes are flying over your house at night. There's local pollution. You know, there's all sorts of issues that people, so in a way there's sort of like different communities coming together about this, and that's also something that I think find quite hopeful, is that people kind of come together around their different interests and sort of make their voices heard about them, and that's definitely a development that we need and that I encourage. So again, if you care about this topic or are affected or both, then please get involved and make your voices heard somehow. Yeah, other than that, thanks again for your attention and for the great discussion. And yeah, have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And final words, yeah, round of applause, even though you can't hear it. Final over to Paul, who will say a few words about our next presentation, which will be in January.
Yeah, the next one is on 25th of January by Zoom, and it will be about entitled The Promise of Gravitational Waves. I don't know if you remember, in 2015 there was first discovery of, after searching, you know, gravitational waves were predicted by Einstein back in, you know, early part of the 20th century, about 100 years ago, and but they were actually detected by this LIGO in the USA, and they've been coming in, not exactly thick and fast, but there've been quite a few of these events, and it tells you about the objects, about basically what's gone on to produce these sort of titanic explosions that actually cause the fabric of space and time to wobble about. And anyway, we've got Sue Bowler coming to speak on that topic. So something rather a bit more, you know, we're talking billions of light years and stuff like that, rather than the here and now and the future of existence, which is like today's talk has been. Anyway, so that's what's coming up. So I hope to see some of you there. Okay. That's me.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, everyone, and hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, okay, cheers.
Merry Christmas. May I be the first to wish you.
Yeah. Fraternal solstitial greetings.
As they say. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Cheers. Thank you, Jefim.
Thank you so much.
Indeed.